paper ballot that you've marked yourself or the ballot that's printed out by the computer for you. The computer printed ballot shows both all of your selections in English so that you can check them, and also in a machine readable code. That was one of the main things I wanted to see in a new system, was a full paper trail, and we will have that with either system. The second big issue I wanted to see was open source software, and only one of the two vendors provided open source software, so that would be the vendor I would recommend. They also had, that was Henry Adkins and Son versus ES&S were the two systems that we looked at. And ES&S still uses proprietary software, and it is, my understanding, it's a Canadian-based company, whereas the Henry Adkins is in Independence, Missouri, so it's not too far. It's almost counts as local. And the open source software company also provided ballots. Their machine-readable ballots had a very simple coding system that he could explain just in the time I was looking at, so that you can check not only that your selections are properly the ones you wanted in English, you can also, if you're interested and want to put in the effort, you can figure out whether or not the machine-readable code is giving you the correct selection, whereas the ES&S system had a barcode that would not be human-readable. So, obviously, I prefer the system with the open source code and human-readable machine code. So, but I feel like that's a really good thing, that we're seeing an improvement in our systems, even if they're not going to be in use in this election year. I wish they were, but we are seeing an improvement. And finally, the third thing that I really wanted to see in our voting systems to improve it is post-election audits to verify that things are being counted correctly. The scanning machines make it a lot easier to count the votes for all the different elections that we're voting on, but you still want to make sure they're counting them correctly. We have the paper trail to do that. We need to use that paper trail to conduct audits on a regular basis to ensure that those are happening correctly. And last week, Chris Kobach introduced legislation that he thinks would do that. I have a little bit of concerns about some of the wording in his proposal, but it's not law, and we have a chance to make our wishes known. So I see that as a good thing. All right, now to talk about what you invited me here for, how trustworthy are the electronic voting systems in Kansas. And this is, I basically wrote a paper on this last year that was published at the American Statistical Association website. But I wanted to talk about how concerning it was regarding the trustworthiness and how much trust we can have in our current systems. This is a map from the Verified Voting website, and all of the white states are essentially rated as completely inadequate for audits. So you can see how Kansas ranks. Sadly, you can also see how the United States as a whole is not really doing a very good job at this point. It's time to make some improvements, in my opinion. I want to talk about this graph. This is the Wisconsin governor race for 2014. And I like to show this graph because this illustrates the type of analysis that I'm doing and why I find it concerning. Let me see if I can get the graph. Is this on now? No. Sorry,
I'm trying the other one. We were having trouble last night.
Oh, okay.
You're the cutest photographer.
I think Camille, you just called it down.
It's dead.
Like this? Is it on? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. The reason I find myself concerned about the various different types of voting equipment, in particular, I'm very concerned about what are called DRE machines, or direct record electronic. I find this particular race gives the clearest illustration of why I should be concerned. This is what's called a cumulative sum chart, and across the bottom are the cumulative votes that are used on each type of different machinery in this particular election, and on the vertical axis we have the percent of the Republican vote for governor in Wisconsin. The green line, the long green line that's more or less straight, those are paper ballots. And that is exactly the kind of line I expect to see if there's no relationship between the size of the precinct, how many votes were cast, and the share of the Republican votes. What we expect with this particular model, what you expect is that if there's no relationship in the order that the summation is done, and these are ordered by size of the precinct, how many votes were cast. If there's no relationship, we will see a more or less straight line, that you find the average, the cum sum finds the average percent, and then it kind of hangs around there. It might go up and down a little bit, but you don't see any clear trends. On the other hand, the red lines are 3 different types of machines. The Optech Eagle, the Dominion, and another Optech Eagle with different ADA equipment. But you see those trends, that climbing up. What that implies is that as the size of the precinct increases, we see a larger share of the Republican candidate gets a larger share of the vote. That tells us there is a pattern there, that there is something that's causing that relationship. Now, that relationship is somewhat unexpected because we don't really expect to see it according to type of machinery. And finally, I also wanted to point out the purple line, a different type of electronic voting machine. But here you can see, while you do see somewhat of an upward trend, it does tend to level out. This is the kind of pattern that you expect to see if there's a relationship, but it's something like a demographic factor. You may see a relationship, but you're also going to see that as you get to the overall average, that's going to level out. You're going to see that straight line. And so the purple is perhaps a little bit suspicious, but it could be adequately explained with other factors like demographics in that area. The green line is what I expect to see if there's no relationship at all. And it does seem really odd that there's only a relationship when we have electronic voting machines. So how trustworthy are these systems in Kansas? When we're using these DRE machines, and that's what we use in Sedgwick County, in Johnson County, in Wyandotte, and in Shawnee, it's a problem because we can't tell. They're non-transparent. They either have no paper trail at all, which is the case for Johnson County, or they have a paper trail that's not available to citizens to verify that they're being accurately counted. That's why I had to go to the extreme of filing a lawsuit to get access to those records in order to verify that the machines are giving us an accurate count. And the statistical patterns that would be typical, if votes were being rigged, if the machines were being manipulated, there are certain statistical patterns that are going to be associated with that. And in fact, we see them with electronic voting machines around the country, and very apparent in states like Kansas with little to no post-election auditing. In other words, we're not checking. Anybody who's involved with the election knows we don't do any checking. In a lot of cases we can't for those counties with no paper trail. So the system is ripe to be taken advantage of. So what convinced me that vote fraud was probable and that audits are necessary in order to make sure it's not happening? And I want to talk about each of these situations in general, or in specific in a few minutes. The 2004 Ohio presidential race, what is termed red-shifted polling results, and the security, transparency of voting machines and software, and finally that the analysis of election results show unexplained patterns that are consistent, indicating a relationship with the largest precincts that correlates with the size of the percent of the Republican vote. Most of the time that relationship is positive. Sometimes it's negative. In other words, there are elections that and equipment that show the opposite pattern. The opposite pattern is at least a little bit more understandable in that we generally expect larger districts to be associated with urban areas, to be associated with a higher Democratic population. But even so, the patterns are suspicious. The 2004 Ohio presidential race. Everybody's familiar with the 2000 Bush-Gore, the whole Florida hanging chads business. That was actually the first time I ever analyzed elections data, by the way. It was the 2000 election. The butterfly ballot was very apparent in analyzing those election results, and I was teaching a beginning statistics course at the time, and it made a very nice classroom presentation on the usefulness and value of statistics in terms of understanding what's going on. 2004 was a little bit different. I did get a chance to examine the Ohio data from 2004, and it did show a relationship between the percent of the Republican vote, and for Bush, it was for the presidential race, and the type of the voting machines that were in use. And they actually did a congressional hearing. There were actually a number of problems, but the official report from the congressional hearing on that election describes it as the abuse and manipulation of electronic voting machines and the arbitrary and illegal behavior of a number of elected and election officials, which effectively disenfranchised tens of thousands of voters in order to change the outcome of an election. In other words, there's an official congressional report that looked into the matter, that held hearings, and that came to the conclusion that the Ohio presidential race was stolen and awarded to Bush, and that if those malfeasances had not occurred, we would have had a different president in 2004. Pretty shocking in my opinion. I was a little stunned when I first read about it. And I'd already looked at the data, so I had my suspicions, but to see it official, and yet nothing was ever done about this to the best of my knowledge. Red-shifted polling results. As a statistician, I personally find this one of the most disturbing things I've read about election statistics. I understand that a lot of people who are not statisticians don't find it quite so disturbing, but that's not unusual. But official vote counts in highly competitive electoral contests were consistently and significantly to the right of polling results, including both pre-election and exit polls. And this, by the way, has been true right up through the 2014 election. And in fact, the 2014 Kansas Senate election had the very largest difference percentage-wise between
Senate, oh, you mean the U.S. Senate?
the U.S. Senate election, 2014 in Kansas, Pat Roberts versus Greg Orman. Huge shift between the actual results and the pre-election polling results.
Why do I go?
This difference in the official vote counts versus the polling results are always assumed to be due to an oversampling of Democrats. There is absolutely no empirical justification for that assumption. That assumption is based on the assumption that our official voting results are accurate, and therefore the polling results are the ones that are off. So polling organizations have now a practice of shifting their poll results to the Republican side prior to release to the public, because what they're most interested in is accurately predicting the results. They don't really care about whether it's accurate in terms of a reflection of the population. They care whether it's accurate in terms of predicting the actual official results. So, and finally, any explanation that might point to corruption of the computerized vote counting mechanism was strictly verboten. And this was Jonathan Simon. He's a former pollster who's now basically trying very hard to get people aware of the problems, and let's make sure we have accurate vote counts. So red-shifted polling results mean that when we read in the media about who's in the lead and all, they're massaging those numbers before they ever release them to us. Security and transparency of voting machines and software. The voting machine software used is proprietary. Even election officials not allowed to inspect it. It's termed black box voting because it's not just lacking transparency, it actually makes things completely opaque. We cannot tell whether or not our vote counts are accurate because we don't have any way to do so. There is a plethora of documented problems leading to inaccurate vote counts, from voters complaining that the machine did not record their vote properly, to uncertified software being required to reports of successfully hacking machines. In other words, these machines are not secure. In particular, the DRE machines are basically, any experts who've looked into it have essentially said we should scrap them. They're not even fixable. That is the case. That's what they did in Ireland. They purchased them and ended up scrapping them before they used them. And there was a report that came out from Penn State University that was funded by Ohio, looked into their voting machines, and that was their basic. They said they don't even have any recommendations to fix the DRE machines. They weren't fixable, just get rid of them. The hackability of the voting machines. Recently, as 2011, U.S. Department of Energy, Argonne National Laboratory hacked into one of Diebold's AccuVote touchscreen systems. Their report asserted that anyone with $26 in parts and an 8th grade science education would be able to manipulate the outcome of an election. Now, I think personally he may be overestimating the value of an 8th grade science education. I'm pretty sure you need at least a high school science education. But it does give you a sense of how vulnerable these machines are to being hacked by anybody with the intelligence to figure out how and the motivation to do so. Johnson's group, which produced the report, breached a system made by another industry giant in the area, Sequoia, using the same man-in-the-middle hack, which was a wireless component inserted between the display screen and the main circuit board, required no knowledge of the actual voting machine. They're basically it's what I would call a leaky system. The security is lacking in so many different areas that there are just a number of ways that people can get in and manipulate the outcome, and they're not secure. And as I said, I recently read or looked at the report from Penn State. They can't be made secure. The guy who did this particular project, he had a PhD in physics. Why did he choose to hack into voting machines? It was basically a weekend project. And he expressed his amazement at the meager funding available to examine America's voting systems. And we don't have a lot of funding to examine those. One of the objections that the Sedgwick County Elections Office has raised to my request to look at those records is that it